So Matt and Brian already introduced me, thank them very much for that. I'm Oliver from UC Davis. I work with the UC Davis WM Keck Center for Active Visualization in the Earth Sciences, which is a mouthful. But it's basically we are doing virtual reality for scientific applications, and we've been doing that for quite a while. Matt fortunately didn't say how long I've been doing this, but I'm going to date myself. I've been doing this since about 1998. What I want to be talking about tonight is locomotion in VR, because we're also going to have Tunga here who's going to talk about this treadmill. Locomotion is a big topic, and so I'm going to talk to you about my thoughts about what that means. It's going to be a talk full of neuroscience, psychology, and linear algebra and software engineering, so awesome. Right, let's get this started off. What is locomotion? Let's define what we're doing here first. I didn't know either. I went to dictionary, and it turns out that locomotion is self-powered motion by which a whole organism changes its location through walking, running, jumping, crawling, swimming, or flying. I think that's from dictionary.com. That's a mouthful as well. So let's just say in shorter terms, it is just getting around virtual spaces, specifically getting around large virtual spaces. Think about taking a stroll through Skyrim or through the Wasteland or Fallout, whatever you have. A more general term for the same idea that I prefer to use, because it doesn't just include things that are self-powered, but also includes things like flying or driving, is navigation. And you might be catching me using these two terms interchangeably throughout. Just roll with it. Okay. So, before we start talking about locomotion in VR, let's start by talking about locomotion in non-VR, meaning in the desktop realm, or when I say desktop, you can also think game console, it doesn't really make a difference. And as it turns out, on the desktop, locomotion is pretty much a solved problem. Has been a solved problem ever since, well, a long, long time ago. Castle Wolfenstein 3D is not even the first game who introduced the concept. And as it so turns out, we've been doing it the exact same way ever since. So how is this actually done? From a conceptual point of view. On the desktop, or on the console, the user in a virtual world is represented by an avatar in the virtual world. An avatar basically being a virtual camera, which has a position in the virtual world, has an orientation into which it's looking. And both of these, position and orientation, are under direct control by the user via some kind of input device. So if you have a PC, then you would be using WASD to move, you would be using the mouse to look around. That has always been like that, it will always be like that. If you're on a console, you have a left and right analog stick on your controller. One of them moves, one of them turns. I can never remember which one does which. But the bottom line is that you have a direct input from your controller onto your avatar, and also the avatar is continuously under program control. If the program says you can't do what you want to do right now, you're not going to do it. That's actually important because, well, you're going to break that in a moment. So I tried to make a little diagram of this to have a visual representation of what this means. So I built this sort of very simple virtual world. It's like your old school corridor crawler, again in Wolfenstein 3D. And this here is your avatar. We are looking from a bird's eye perspective. That's the head, that's the shoulders, and this is the cone of vision of your avatar in this virtual world. So now when you navigate, or when you locomote, you're moving your avatar through space, and let's just say our avatar takes 1, 2, 3 steps forward, and so that's what it looks like then, and then the avatar turns 90 degrees to the right, 1, 2, 3, and then takes another step forward. Super simple stuff. There's really nothing to it. That's why I said on the desktop, this is pretty much a solved problem. You know how this works. Okay, but we are of course not here to talk about desktop stuff. We're here to talk about VR. And it turns out in VR, locomotion is hard. Everything is hard in VR, but locomotion is hard as well. So why is that? And there's two reasons. One of them is VR breaks a couple of assumptions of desktop locomotion. And also VR introduces new problems that simply didn't exist on the desktop. What assumptions does it break? I emphasized just a moment ago that on the desktop, the avatar that represents the user is under complete control by the program. In VR, that's not really quite the case anymore, because now you have a user who is not sitting on a desk chair in front of a screen or on a couch in front of a TV, but you have a user who is standing in a space and can move around. That's the whole idea behind VR, that you're being head tracked, that you can move through your virtual space. You have your Vive headset with a lighthouse tracking system, you have your Oculus Rift with constellation tracking system, you want to move around. And of course, that motion is not under program control. The program cannot prevent you from taking a step to the left. It can shock you, it can kick you, but it shouldn't really do that. So what it means is it will lead to a problem called boundary violation. I'm going to go into detail about that later, so just keep that in the back of your mind. And then the new problems that are introduced by VR are basically three. One of them, the big one, is simulator sickness. Everybody's heard of that. VR makes you sick, we don't want that. And this is one of the things that makes you sick about VR, locomotion. And then the other two things are sort of related. It is fragmentation, both in input device hardware. I don't have enough fingers to count the different devices, and let's just say, I don't even have enough fingers to count the different models of treadmill that are on the market right now. And the same fragmentation applies not just to devices, but also to the metaphors, to the user interfaces, how we translate actions on these devices to movement in the virtual space. So we're going to talk about all those at nauseating detail. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit about what it means to be a user in a physical space in VR. So here, meet Alice. Alice is our user. There she is, from the top down. That's her head, her shoulders. She's wearing some headset that's just called an Oculus Rift. And she's standing in her VR room. Her VR room is an actual space. It has 4 walls. There's a door, there's a couch, entertainment center, there's a ficus. So that's just her setup that she has. And being in VR, she can move around freely inside the space. And of course, when she's doing that, it has to be somehow represented in the virtual world as well. So now, of course, when she is not wearing the headset, this is what she sees. She sees her real environment, but the moment she puts the headset on, of course, the real world gets replaced by the virtual world. And to express that in a diagram, I kind of try to combine this diagram I'm showing you right now with the one I showed you earlier. So now the blue stuff is still the real world, where she really is, but the red stuff, that is the same virtual environment I had on the slide like 2 minutes ago, that same corridor corner. And so when she has the headset on, of course, she sees the red stuff. She doesn't see the blue stuff anymore. So now she can still move. That means if she, let's say, takes a couple of steps forward in order to peek down this hallway here, then the system cannot just ignore that. It has to represent it. Otherwise, the whole illusion of VR will break, that you are in this virtual space. So the system has to react to this, even though she moved there, without doing anything in terms of user interface. She didn't press any buttons, she didn't push any joysticks, she just took a few steps forward, and still the system has to react to that, even though there's no direct input channel for this. That's the first challenge. And so here she's peeking down the hallway, she might be moving over there to the right, she might be checking out the tapestries, and then she might be moving over to the left, and oops, we have a problem. What's the problem? It's kind of obvious. She shouldn't be here, right? That's a wall in the virtual environment, and she shouldn't be able to walk through that wall, but of course she did. It's a virtual wall. There's no way for her to feel any kind of resistance. There's no way for the program to constrain her. So she is now standing somewhere where it doesn't make any sense anymore. It's a real-life wall hack, so to speak. That can't happen, and that is called a boundary violation. That is one of the things that we have to address when we do locomotion in VR. And it gets worse than that. Let's say she walks up and tries to go through this wrong button, and she tries to walk through this doorway, and it ends up like this, and that's also a problem. As you can see, it's not a boundary violation, but that is very small comfort because she just violated her 70-inch flat screen TV. This can't happen, of course. And this is really a fundamental issue because it means no matter how big your physical space is in which you can move around, at some point you're going to run out of space. Because you always want the virtual world to be larger than the physical world in which you are. There are many applications where that's not the case, but again, if you want to take a stroll to the Skyrim, then your living room is not going to be large enough for that. So this is where we have to deal with it, and this is now where we need some way of applying the same basic techniques we apply on the desktop by explicitly moving via pressing a button or pushing a joystick or doing something else. We have to do the same thing in VR. So what she was doing so far was real locomotion. She was actually physically moving around. What we need now is virtual locomotion. And that's where things get a little bit complicated unless you have a good framework, and we will talk about the framework. So to wrap it up, to summarize, we need virtual locomotion even in VR because our virtual space is usually going to be bigger than our physical space. Otherwise, where's the fun in that? So we need to have some way of thinking, some framework, some set of mind that allows us to combine these two modes of locomotion, real and virtual, in a unified fashion so that we can handle them in a sane way from the program. If you don't do this, if you handle them separately, it gets really, really messy, really, really quick. And one idea of coming up with such a framework is that we are going back to that avatar-based navigation we do on the desktop, but you turn it inside out. So let me go back a few slides. Well, I copied the slides. And let's go to our first example again. We have again the virtual world. We have our avatar with his or her cone of vision. And now we do the same thing. We want to take 1, 2, 3 steps forward, turn 90 degrees to the right, and take one more step forward. But now, instead of moving the avatar through the virtual world, we are going to be moving the virtual world around the avatar. It sounds complicated, but actually it's really simple. I just take 1, 2, 3 steps forward, turn 90 degrees to the right, and take one more step forward. This is the exact same thing that we did in the first set of slides. We're just looking at it from a different point of view. It doesn't really make any difference. From what is displayed on the screen to the user is exactly the same thing. Even mathematically it's the same thing because everything is relative, but it's just a different way of thinking about it. And the nice thing about it, the reason why I did this, is that this way of thinking about it applies to virtual reality as well. What we're doing is, we are applying this principle by doing virtual locomotion, not by moving the avatar through the virtual world, because the avatar is the user. There's no way to physically move the user through the world if the user doesn't want to, but we're just moving the virtual world around the user. And then, in addition to that, let the user walk freely through the physical space to combine these two modes. So let me go back to my diagram. We have also seen this one before. Again, here's Alice in a VR space, here's her virtual environment, and now she wants to follow basically the same trajectory. She wants to walk through this hallway, take a right. And she's doing that now, initially virtually, by pushing, let's say, on a joystick or something. And she is taking, whoops, wrong button again. She is taking 1, 2, 3 steps, turning 90 degrees to the right, and taking 1 step forward. And you notice what happened here. What happened really is that we changed the position and orientation of the virtual world with respect to the physical world. And that's really the important take-home message from this, the important concept behind it. So now she's at this point, and now she decides, enough with the virtual locomotion, I'm going to walk the rest of the way. So she takes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 steps, and ends up where she really is. Now, of course, she's actually looking at a couch and a plant, but she doesn't know that because she is seeing this room that she has stepped into. So that, in a nutshell, is the idea here. So now let's get a little bit mathematical, not really very much. As I already explained, the only difference between this end state that we are in here and the state where we began is that we translated, we shifted the virtual world to the real world, and we rotated the virtual world against the real world. So mathematically that means we applied a geometric or mathematical transformation to our virtual world versus the real world. And I call this transformation NT, which is short for navigation transformation. I warned you earlier, I want to be mixing up these terms a little bit. So again, this navigation transformation is composed of an arbitrary translation and an arbitrary rotation. And if you're really adventurous, you can maybe even have an arbitrary scaling, which lets you do really cool things, but that's for another day. So now, what about avatar representation? I mentioned earlier that on the desktop, your user is represented by a virtual avatar, which you have to maintain. It has to have a position and orientation. Turns out in VR, we don't any longer need that, because now the user is our avatar. If we need an avatar position, we can always get it because we know physically where the user is. That's what the tracking system gives us, your constellation or your lighthouse. And so we just take that physical position and we transform it by the inverse of that navigation transformation NT, and that gives us our avatar position and orientation in the virtual space. Sounds kind of complicated, but actually it makes things really, really simple. We don't have to keep track of these two independent things which might diverge and cause all kinds of trouble. They are directly related by this mathematical transformation. There's a reason why I'm explaining all this. Trust me, just go with it. And one of the immediate upshots of this, and we have to take my word for it right now, is that this way of thinking about it, this approach is extremely generic. It doesn't just apply to walking, it applies to all possible ways of navigation that you can think about, from flying to jumping to web slinging to whatever. It applies to all of them. It fits all of them under the exact same framework, which makes it really easy to reason about it and specifically to implement it in code. And that's where we want to go. So now that we have a framework to think about locomotion, now we can actually talk about the problems that arise from locomotion. And as I mentioned earlier, there are 3 problem areas. There's simulator signals, there's boundary violations, we ran into that, and there's device/UI fragmentation. And of those, simulator signals is the big one. Of those, simulator signals is definitely the big one. So let's talk about that one first. The bane of VR, simulator signals. Where does it come from? As it so turns out, and I'm not an expert on this, so I'm trying to pretend I am. As it turns out, primates in general, and humans in specific, have 3 independent systems to sense motion. One reason you could think for that is that for someone who lives in trees or hunts other animals, knowing where they're going is a really important skill, which is why we have 3 independent ones that are redundant and help each other. The first one is the visual system. When I move through the world, my eyes see the world moving towards me. And my brain assumes, well, the world is probably not actually moving, so it's probably you moving through the world, and that is where I get the sense of motion. This principle is called vection. It is very important. It comes up when a large part of the field of view moves in a concerted fashion, if it moves towards you, or if it moves laterally, or if it rotates around you. This is a very strong motion cue to our brains. The second very important one is the vestibular cue, where in our inner ears, in the vestibular organ, we have essentially an IMU, an inertial measurement unit, the same exact kind of measurement unit that's actually in all modern VR headsets to measure their position orientation, and we have it naturally built in, and it does exactly the same thing. It measures the acceleration and rotation of our head, and it is, again, it provides us very important motion tools. Even if I close my eyes, I still know that I just took a step forward because my inner ear told me so. And it also tells me that I'm now leaning to the side. It essentially allows you to not fall over while standing. And then there's a third one, and that is not quite so strong, but also important to know, and that is the proprioceptive sense. Even with our eyes closed and in darkness, our body knows exactly where its individual parts are. Even if I'm not looking at it, I know exactly where my hand is, which allows me to do this, unless I'm drunk, in which case you know. But the idea being that we have sensors in our muscles, in our bones, in our joints, which tell us exactly where everything is. So what that means is, if I take a step forward, my feet know that my right foot just moved by about 1 meter forward and that I now moved 1 meter. So that's another motion cue. And of course, in the real world, normally all 3 of these match up. If my eyes tell me I moved 1 meter forward, and my inner ear tells me I moved 1 meter forward, and my bones tell me I moved 1 meter forward, that's because I moved 1 meter forward, unless I'm on the ship and again I get seasickness. Or unless you're in VR, where you get simulator signals. So what's the basic fundamental problem? The basic issue is that virtual reality, as it is right now, only simulates vision. It doesn't touch any of the other senses. It only creates a virtual image, but it doesn't otherwise affect your sense of where you are and what you're doing. So, and that of course is a problem because it leads to mismatches. So there's one piece of good news. Real locomotion, meaning when you physically walk through your VR space wearing a headset, that is perfectly fine. There's no problem with that. Because your bones tell you took a step forward, your inner ear tells you took a step forward, and the virtual image in your headset, if everything works correct, which is a big if, also tells you took a step forward, everything matches, and there's no problem at all. So that's good. But, of course, as I said earlier, we cannot just do everything with real locomotion. We have to have a virtual way of moving, otherwise our spaces get too small. And as you can imagine now, I don't even have to explain it really, virtual locomotion causes a mismatch, because if I push a stick to move the world 1 meter towards me, I see the world, the virtual world, moving 1 meter towards me. But because I didn't really move, my inner ear doesn't detect anything, my bones don't detect anything, and so there's a disagreement there. And that disagreement causes an issue. Simulator signals. There's a really fun hypothesis that describes what actually happens there, and I personally subscribe to this one, and that is that the body interprets these sensory mismatches between your inner ear, your proprioceptive sense, and your vision sense as poisoning via neurotoxins. Essentially, your body assumes that if your senses don't match up, you're hallucinating. And so what does it do? Well, it tries to purge the toxin by sweating, by making you nauseated, by making you vomit, and then by making you fatigued. Essentially, the sweating, trying to get out the toxin that's already in your body. The vomiting, of course, trying to get out the leftover toxin that's still in your stomach. And then the fatigue, after you've purged all this, to make you lie down and sleep it off, basically. So these are exactly the kind of symptoms that you're seeing in simulator signals, where you start sweating first, and then you get a really nauseated feeling, and then, the next one is vomiting. Don't want that. Not good. So this explains it very nicely what's going on. So now, based on this understanding, we can now try and figure out how can we solve this, how can we make it better at least. And before I go on, I have to have this public service announcement right now. If you are using VR, and if you feel the slightest symptoms of simulator sickness, do not fight through it. Do not try to gut it out like, oh, I'm going to get used to it. It doesn't work. Usually what happens is it gets worse and worse and worse. For some people it works, but for most people it doesn't. And if you keep doing it, you might actually develop something called VR aversion, which is like a conditioned reflex where even the thought about putting on a headset, you already run to the bathroom, which is not good. You don't want that. So the rule is the moment you feel anything, the moment you feel getting warm or sweating, just close your eyes, take off the headset, do something else for a couple of minutes. Please, do me a favor and do that. It's not good. Okay, so now knowing where sim sickness comes from, that it's a mismatch between motion cues, what can we do to avoid it? And the most surefire way to avoid it is simply to completely avoid virtual locomotion. Because if that's what's causing the problem, if you don't do it, then you have no problem. And that's actually, incidentally, what Valve did when they put out their headset. They set up demos where you have a large tracked space, and then the virtual space will always fit exactly to that space, so you would be able to move around and interact with things, but there would be no virtual motion. And of course, what everybody took home from that is, oh, Valve solved motion sickness. No, they didn't really. They avoided it by just not allowing you to move to larger spaces, which is a valid approach, but keep that in mind. So how do you do that? Well, you just limit the size of your virtual world. If it is always not bigger than your real world, then you have no problem at all. And there's also another way of doing it, and I don't want to get into that, and that is that you very slightly relax this one-to-one correspondence between you moving in the real space and at the same time moving through the virtual space. You can get away with it. Our senses are not 100% accurate. There's a bit of a fudge factor there. How big it is, kind of unknown. And if you want to learn more about it, just Google redirected walking. It's a really cool technique, but I can't get into it right now. It's just a talk by itself. So that's just for further notes. Okay, so if you can't get rid of virtual locomotion because you want to take a trip down a very large virtual world, what else can you do? Well, again, the problem that comes from virtual locomotion is vection. Vection is not good because vection causes a mismatch. So is there some way to reduce or avoid vection? Well, there's one way. And that is vection, as I mentioned earlier as an aside. It only works if your brain believes that you're in a real environment. If your brain doesn't believe that, then it will think, oh, I see something moving towards me, but it's not real. That means it's not I'm not moving, but it is moving. And then, of course, vection doesn't apply, and then your senses line up again. That works great, by the way. And there are tricks of doing that, but of course, if the whole purpose of your VR application is to create the sense you are in a place where you're not really, then this does not apply, obviously, because it breaks that illusion. So this is just something that if you can get away with it, great, but usually you can't. So if you can't avoid vection, how can you make it a little bit less strong? And there's one very interesting result, and that is you can provide a fixed frame of reference, something for your brain to latch onto. For example, in a driving game, you would be sitting in your chair in real world, and virtually you are sitting inside the driver's seat of a car. And you look around and you see the car interior and you're driving, and it turns out this doesn't really cause simulator sickness, unless you're already prone to driving to car sickness, in which case all bets are off. But the reason why it doesn't do that is because your brains have learned that if you are in something and it's kind of locked to you, then things are okay. It's moving with you, you're not out there on your own, your brain is okay with that. So this works for like plane cockpits, it works for driving games, which is why they're fairly popular in VR. It even works if you have a very thin representation of a fixed frame. Just drawing a little wireframe cube might already help. Or just drawing a horizon. It's an ongoing area of research to do this. There's a lot of psychology going on that I don't really know about, but it's something that can be done. And then there's another approach to reduce vection, which is to, instead of moving smoothly, you move in jerky, discrete steps. As it turns out, vection happens when the world moves towards you smoothly. If the world moves towards you like this, it doesn't seem to cause vection, because now you don't really believe it's real anymore. And so you can use that as a way of doing locomotion by, instead of walking smoothly from A to B, you just, I can't do this now in the real world, you can teleport by a short distance. You just blink from here to there, and if you rotate, you don't rotate smoothly, but you rotate in increments of, let's say, 30 degrees. Sounds crazy, but it actually works for a lot of people. It has been tried by a large number of people. They call it comfort mode because it's comfortable for a bunch of people. It is a little bit, not dizzying, it's jarring, I would say. But for a lot of people, it actually solves the problem very effectively. I just want to throw that out. Okay, so if you can't do that, what else can you do? Well, how about providing additional stimuli? The problem is that VR only creates vection, doesn't create proprioceptive or vestibular cues. Can you maybe fake those? And the answer is, well, maybe you can. Let's talk about proprioception first. If you have a treadmill, or a slide mill like the Cyber Virtualizer, where you're doing the motion of walking, even though you're not actually physically moving, then the proprioceptive sense tells you you're moving, and your vestibular sense still tells you you're not moving, but now it's 2 out of 3, and 2 out of 3 ain't bad. So, it's not perfect, but it might help, and there are reports that it does help. Turns out even doing something as simple as this, walking in place, you simulate the motion of walking, even though you're not actually walking, it helps for a bunch of people to make this problem not so bad. So the idea here is that you essentially reinforce the visual cue by having something else, in this case proprioception. Now I mentioned the big one besides vision is vestibular. Is there any way to stimulate the vestibular sense? Well, there kind of is. There's a way of directly stimulating your inner ear, essentially running a current, literally, through your inner ear, plugging electrodes in there. I'm not going to do that. It's called direct galvanic vestibular stimulation. Again, look it up. It's pretty crazy. It might work in the future. I wouldn't maybe recommend it for right now. But it is possible. But then there's this other idea, and it only occurred to me really recently. If you have a real treadmill, not a slide mill, but a treadmill that is driven by motors, then you can maybe program the treadmill in a way that it simulates the vestibular cues you're getting from real motion. Again, this would take me a whole hour to explain, so I'm not going to try it. It's just I want to throw it out there, that this occurred to me recently. It occurred to probably a bunch of other people much earlier than that, but it doesn't matter. It's something I'm currently thinking about how to do this. I hope it's going to be successful. If it is, I'm going to yell it from the rooftops. Anyway, so if you can't do any of these, we have anything else left to do, and that turns out a little bit of out-of-the-box thinking. You can, if you can't fake a vestibular signal, maybe you can drown out the real vestibular signal by overwhelming it with noise. And when I say noise, I don't mean yelling into your ear, but I mean noise in terms of noisy measurements. The acceleration signals that your ear is actually getting from you taking a few steps are fairly small. And you can override them, you can swamp them by creating much, much bigger signals by essentially doing this. So that sounds crazy, but what happens is if you're now virtually moving and you just do this, then your inner ear senses this large motion, and it might not be able to sense the small motion or the small acceleration coming from your motion through the space. And that again, now your brain thinks the cues are matching up, and that would get around motion signals. Now if you look back at this walking in place thing, what motion are you making? You're making this kind of motion. So it might be that this is a combination, that walking in place works because it's the combination of the proprioceptive stimulation and the noise it creates on the acceleration system. We don't really quite know that yet. It's not my area. When I'm talking to people whose area it is, I'm very curious about the results. So that sort of wraps up as much as I want to talk about sim signals. It's a really, really big problem, and a lot of people are working on it, and it has a lot of direct implications on how VR software is developed, of how Locomotion is developed, and so forth. So it's a really big, big thing. There's a lot of research to be done. Let's move on to the next one, which is boundary violations. I already showed you an example of a boundary violation. Let's go back to Alice. Now she's taking a step to the left, she's looking at the wall, and now she's doing the unthinkable, she's taking another step forward. So she just, in one step, walked right through the wall, and that, of course, that can't happen, that's not good. If there is a door here that requires a key, she just short-circuited an entire section of the game, can't happen. So what is the underlying problem? I already mentioned it earlier. Software cannot prevent you in the physical world from taking a step forward unless you have a shock collar or something like that, and we don't really want to do that. So the software can't prevent you from taking this step, but unfortunately it can't just ignore it either. Because, well, this is the real-life wall hack. You can just short-circuit a game goal. You can, if there's a shooter game, you can shoot someone in the back by stepping through a wall. That's not cool. So we have to do something about that. And there's one idea that has been floating around how to address this issue, and the idea is quite simple. When the program detects that you are guilty of a boundary violation by having put your face into a wall, then it just blacks out your vision until you go back to where you were, and then your vision comes back just as an indication you're where you're not supposed to be, and more importantly, to not let you peek where you're not supposed to peek. I personally have a bit of a problem with this approach. It causes two issues. It causes usability issues and representation issues, but I don't really want to talk about this in detail because I'm already rambling and way too long anyway. So let me just show you this awesome slide I made, and I'm going to leave that up there and you can figure it out later. So here's an alternative idea to which I happen to subscribe. Instead of letting a boundary violation happen and then frantically trying to react to it and fix it, why not just avoid them in the first place? And here's how it goes. Oops, no, you're right. So here we are back to the last valid step that Alice took. She's currently standing right here. And now in this tick of the game engine, she took one step from here to there, which of course should not happen. So what the program does at this point, it senses that there is a boundary violation between that position and that one, using the exact same collision detection method that the game engine already uses to do this kind of thing. And then once it has detected that there will be a boundary violation, it just breaks down the single step into several sub-steps, where the first sub-step takes Alice right up with her face to the wall, like this one, and then the next sub-step, she still has to go from here to there because she, in the real world, made this step, will just push the virtual world along with her. In other words, it will do it like this. Essentially using the same locomotion technique that we're already using for everything else by applying a translation, and by having pushed the world with her, Alice now ends up in a position where she's still face up right against the wall. And that works. It actually works great because boundary violations never happen. The real user, no matter how he or she moves, can never step outside the virtual world, can never step through obstacles. But now you're going to say there's of course an issue. I just preached about simulator sickness. And this is a clear violation of the principles of simulator sickness, because her body knows she took a step forward, her vestibular organ knows she took a step forward, but the world moved with her. So the visual sense tells that she's still face up against the wall. So that should make her sick. But turns out in practice it seems to be okay. This needs a lot more research. I've pretty much tried this on myself and a bunch of other people. But the reason why I believe that this works, it's like pushing a car when you try to jumpstart a car. You have your hands on the trunk, and your face right up to it, and you push it and you take a step, and because you're pushing the car, it actually never changes, moves relative to you, so it's the same kind of effect. And pushing a car doesn't make you motion sick, so why should this make you motion sick? Well, that's my hypothesis, and I'm sticking to it. So there's a lot, like I said, there's a lot more looking into it to be done, but that's the fundamental idea. So that wraps up boundary violations. Again, it's another big problem, and I mentioned only two approaches. Nobody can agree on how to do it, what to do. I like the second one, others like the first one. There will be probably 50 more, so just keep an eye out for that. It's an interesting research topic. Let's talk about the last problem, and that is now something that's a much more concrete and applicable thing. Now we're getting from math into software engineering. Fragmentation. I can't count the number of different input devices that are in existence or have been proposed for VR. There are mouse and keyboard, game controllers, special controllers like flight sticks and steering wheels, and motion controllers like PS Move, or motion capture like Kinect or Matt's Stompz devices, or treadmills like George's, or the slide mills and what have you, jetpacks, brain-computer interfaces, or what have you. There's also a plethora of different user interfaces, of metaphors of how to use these devices to actually then move through space. There's walking. There's jumping, there's leaning, there's warping. You can't do warping. Warping is you point this direction, you start flying there. There's hookshotting, where you point at that wall and press a button, and then you just get sucked towards the wall. There's web slinging if you have a Spider-Man game. You catch my drift. So there's all these things. And as it turns out, so far, and I've been looking at this for a long time, there hasn't been the VR equivalent of WASD plus mouse look. There has not been the one thing that works for everything. And it's probably not going to happen, because VR, there are so many different special circumstances and special applications and things you want to do. So we will have to live with this fragmentation. It is not going to go away. There will not going to be the same monoculture as on the desktop, where everybody uses mouse and keyboard, or on the console, where everybody uses 15 buttons and 2 analog sticks. Not going to happen. I won't put money on it right now. So we have to deal with it. And this seems an unsurmountable problem. How is a poor game developer or software developer who wants to make the next, Call of Duty, how are they going to support 500 different input devices if 400 of those input devices are going to be used by 0.0% of the user base? That's not worth their money. They cannot possibly do it. If you're a device developer, if you develop a treadmill, if you develop a motion capture device, how are you going to ensure that your device is not just supported by one application or game, but by all of them? Seems unsurmountable. But no, of course it's not, otherwise I wouldn't bring it up, right? And that's kind of my thing, that's what I'm doing. So let's go back 30 slides, where we talked about this mathematical transformation and the genericity of it. I've brought that slide back and I just put it in red here. Locomotion is reduced to a mathematical transformation NT. And any possible locomotion UI is reduced to an incremental transformation that takes the current way how the virtual world is aligned with the real world and changes it a tiddly little bit into an NT prime, that is the new way how it's done. By an incremental translation, by an incremental rotation, everything, all of these different devices I mentioned, all of these different UIs I mentioned can be broken down to this single operation. And if you're now a software engineer, like I like to think of myself, then this screams for a plug-in interface implementation, where instead of having a game developer develop 500 different ways of moving through the world, the application developer does only one thing. They expose a Locomotion interface, which is, I don't want to get too technical, but which is a hook into the program where someone else can call in and say, hey, I would like to change the current navigation transformation to this other very slightly different navigation transformation NT prime. That is the only hook, the only input that the application needs to do all these different ways of navigating. So then, once that is caught by someone who makes a treadmill, then the application can implement all the constraints it wants to keep the user's feet locked to the ground, to prevent boundary violations in whatever way the application sees fit, what have you. But it's a single place. It's done only once. And now a UI developer or a device developer can create plugins that implement some way of taking raw input device data, like the rotary controllers from a treadmill or the analog sticks from a gamepad, and translate those into these incremental transformations NT to NT prime. There's a million different ways of doing that. I only brought you a couple of examples, but it all boils down to the same thing. And then the most important bit is that these plugins are not baked into an application, but they are separate. They are loaded in on demand and dynamically. Again, in computer science terms, they are DLLs or DSOs, depending on what operating system you're on, but they are just there, and when you need them, you load them. They're a plugin. So what's the upshot of this? The upshot of this is that the applications now, unless they have very specific needs, do not implement any Locomotion methods. It is left completely to third parties. Unless, of course, let's say you're making a Spider-Man game, you cannot get away with making a Spider-Man game without web slinging. So you will have to implement that. But that's the one thing. So, meaning that for an application developer, this is really easy. They only have to do one thing, but they have to do right. And then if you're a device developer, if you make, let's say, inertial motion sensing motion capture device that's used for Locomotion, then you can create a plugin that is the best possible way of taking the raw inputs from your device, like measuring your steps, and translating that into a move 1 meter along this particular direction or take a side step by whatever, half a meter. You can do the best job you can because you made the device, and the new device you developed is now automatically supported in all the existing games. Let's assume there's something like a VR Call of Duty that someone made. It's of course closed source, you bought it in a store, and now you make this plugin, and because it's dynamically loaded, you can actually load your plugin into this existing game and use your completely new device with this existing game, which means that your new device is now automatically supported by everything and not just by one or two things. And the same applies to a UI researcher who just invented this new crazy way of doing Locomotion that doesn't cause lection or doesn't cause sim sickness, and instead of having to implement it in their own little test bed, which is usually crappy, let's be honest, and nobody wants to try it, you can just use this new way of navigating immediately by just downloading it from somewhere, putting it into your folder, and then you can use it from within the VR Call of Duty. And so now lots of people can try it immediately, and you get a lot of feedback, and you can be a lot quicker about your research. So the bottom line is everybody wins. It's great for the users, it's great for the developers, it's great for everybody. And now, of course, you're going to say, that's crazy talk, that's never going to work. But no, actually it works. I know that because I've made that software. That's kind of my thing. So the VUI VR tool implements exactly this method of doing not just navigation, but doing everything else. How to pick up objects, move them around, whole another talk, but it exists. And if you want to learn more about it, you can just go to my webpage, or you can Google me, and you can find out what it does. You can check it out. But the bottom line is, this actually works. And it's crazy, I know, but it actually works. And I think it is the way how it should be done going forward, because like I said, this jungle of different metaphors and devices is not going to go away. And I want to leave you with that. And I took already a little bit too much of everybody's time. I apologize for that. But if you guys have like 2 more minutes, I made this movie yesterday. I want to see a cool movie. Yeah. It's totally not about Locomotion. Okay, great. I kind of strong-armed you into that now, but let me bring this up. I hope it works now. Hang on, where is it? This is the other thing I do when I don't think about Locomotion. Hang on. Okay, how am I going to do this? This might be tricky. This is the first time I try to run a presentation of this laptop, so who knows if it's going to work, huh? Good enough.